public relations expert and publicist, Megan Beatie. Megan, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. We were negotiating to do an episode for author Amber Smith, who will be here this summer. And she included you on the email. I thought, oh my gosh, what an amazing opportunity. We absolutely have to talk to somebody like Megan Beatie. So I'm so glad you made the time for us today. If you would tell esteemed audience just a little bit about yourself and your expertise.
Sure thing. Well, I was an English major in college and loved books all my life. I mean, just to tell you a silly little anecdote, when I got my driver's license at age 16, I did not know how to get around my own hometown because every time I got in the car when my parents would drive me, I would read a book. I read every single moment I possibly could. So always a book lover. And after I graduated from college, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I found out that there was actually a school you could go to learn about book publishing. And at the time, it was called the Radcliffe Publishing Course. Now it got moved to the Columbia Publishing Course in New York. And I went to Radcliffe in Boston for a summer and learned all about every aspect of publishing, from copy editing to publicity. And I heard the course would bring in these speakers from top literary agents and heads of publishing houses from New York to come talk to us young people about publishing. And I remember so vividly hearing Carol Schneider, who was the head of publicity for Random House. She came and talked to us, and it was like I was struck by a lightning bolt. Like, that is my dream job, to talk about books, to champion books, to go to book parties, and to kind of be I think of it as being a cheerleader for books, because you're really, you're trying to get people excited about the various books that you're championing. So I finished the course and ended up, the course helped the graduates get jobs in New York at publishing houses. And so this was 1996. And we were these young college graduates starting our first jobs in publishing, and the starting salaries were like $20,000. Salary. But we were like, we don't care. We're gonna do this. We're gonna my two best friends and I shared a 1-bedroom in Manhattan, and we got jobs. I was lucky enough to get the highest salaried job of my class of $27,000. I mean, seriously, that was like, whoa.
I mean, we're talking 1996 money, so that maybe what would be 35, maybe even 39,000 today.
And we're talking living in Manhattan too. So where the apartments, I mean, I think we paid like $1,200, maybe more than that, for our Upper East Side apartment. So
you said it was you and 2 other people in the 1-bedroom?
Oh yeah. So we had, my 2 friends shared the room, and then we kind of divided up the main room with a wall. I mean, it was crazy. But it was the thrill and the glamour of going into New York City publishing. So so the job I got was I was assisting the executive director of publicity at Putnam. And so Putnam at the time was not, this is way before Putnam was merged with Penguin, which is now merged with Random House. So Putnam was its own entity, and published, I mean, amazing authors: Tom Clancy, Dick Francis, Robert Parker, Alice Hoffman. I mean, you name it, these major best-selling authors, and they would come in to meet with my boss, and I would just like have to pinch myself that these authors that I had read and was in awe of were like there in front of me. So I worked for Putnam for almost a year. Speaking very candidly, if you've seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, that was a lot of my experience working at Putnam that first year in book publishing. It was very, very.
Do you want to identify who was the Meryl Streep character by name?
I don't know if I should. I think I mean, it's been so long. It was Marilyn Ducksworth, who is a brilliant mind and a brilliant publicist. But man, oh man, I mean, I had some of the most traumatic times of my entire career that first year of publishing, which I don't think I'll share any real details. But it was, if you've seen the movie, there's a scene in where the Meryl Streep character sends Andy for a skirt, and she gives no information except she wants a skirt, but she obviously wants something very, very particular. And Andy realizes, or she asks a colleague, I think, that she can't ask any more questions. And that's a lot of how my first year, as I remember it, was. Like, you would get 10% of the information, and you have to figure out the other 90%, because you couldn't ask your boss, but you had to deliver what was in her mind. So it was very, very challenging. But
well, obviously you've moved on and you've flourished since then. So how did you overcome that environment? What tips can you give for somebody? Obviously publishing is a whole nother world, and there's no Meryl Streep characters anymore, but just in case there was somebody who was in a situation like that, what advice would you give them?
You know, it was baptism by fire, and I'm so grateful for that year. I really am. You know, I look back and I worked with, again, an amazing publicist who was just at the top of her game. And I learned so much by observing and taking mental notes. And, you know, she really set a standard of excellence in her work for me that I think I've carried throughout my career. And you know, and she led me in an indirect way. You know, I was so like, oh my gosh. The other thing was about this job, I was, and cut me off if I'm going into too much detail, but
no such thing for our listeners.
Okay. So the other thing about this job, it was very secretarial. So, and I knew, like, starting out in publishing, you have to pay your dues. There's a lot of old-fashioned aspects about publishing, which we can get into later, but you really have to pay your dues. So, you know, I had graduated from Middlebury College. I was a few years out of college. I thought I was pretty, you know, pretty hot, and it really had to. I had to, you know, tell myself, pay your dues. It's okay to be a secretary, because you will eventually get the opportunities to do real book publicity. And I realized in my work at Putnam that that my boss, what she needed was a secretary, an administrative assistant. It wasn't so much about nurturing my growth, but I needed to fulfill what she needed done. And that was fine short term, but long term, I had places to go. So I ended up, you know, it's fun to think back on my career and remember the women who were so instrumental, directly or indirectly, in where I am today. Because the next woman that I'm thinking of is a woman, her name is Aileen Boyle, and she's a freelance publicist now. At the time, she was at HarperCollins, and I interviewed with her for an associate, because at the time with Marilyn at Putnam, I was a publicity assistant, and I interviewed with Aileen Boyle to be a associate publicist, which is the next jump up. And I was just so excited. I thought I just completely nailed the interview, and that Aileen was going to hire me, and I was going to go to work for HarperCollins. And she didn't hire me, but she recommended me to a friend of hers who was at this book PR agency called Goldberg McDuffie Communications. And I had, at Putnam, I'd heard about Goldberg McDuffie. They was a freelance PR firm. But I went in for an interview with the woman whose name is Grace McQuaid at Goldberg McDuffie. And I interviewed with Neil McDuffie, and then with Lynn Goldberg, who was the head of the company. And it was like I coming home. Like, they loved my experience. They loved that I had, like, been in the trenches at Putnam, and they loved me, and they made me a job offer, and they made me a full publicist. So I went to work for Goldberg McDuffie Communications end of 1997, and I worked for Goldberg McDuffie Communications for 17 years. It was amazing. It was like truly, I mean, a dream come true, because when I went to Goldberg McDuffie, it was a place where they gave me my own books to represent, even though I'd just been an assistant, and they said, you know, here's what we want you to do. We want you to, you know, we'll nurture you, we'll teach you. We want you to ask questions. If you don't understand what to do, ask us. And it was like this mix of freedom and trust, and I thrived there, and I'm so proud that I was able to work there for 17 years. I worked there for 3 years in the New York office, and worked with, I mean, all kinds of authors. From, I mean, I remember the first book that was my very own to do the publicity for was a book called Found Dogs by Elise Lumpkin, and it was this beautiful book of photo essays of dogs that had been rescued, and the people who had rescued them, and the ways in which those dogs had changed their new owners' lives. And it was such a great book to work on. I'm a big dog lover. And it's just a very special book as I think back, because it really was my very first book that I did the publicity for. But I worked on all sorts of books. I mean, I did Monica Lewinsky's book. I worked on that book with my boss, which was, I mean, an experience like nothing ever in my entire career.
What was the experience of doing the publicity for a book like that?
Well, you know, it was beyond anything, because it wasn't a book. It was a news event. So I was the point person for the media, and it was actually not written by Monica. It was written by Andrew Morton, who's written a lot of very juicy books about the royal family and various others. So, and he's fantastic. He's a wonderful interview. So he was really the person who was going to be doing the interviews for the book, but everyone wanted to do something on this book. So I would be at my desk, and my phone rang nonstop for, like, I mean, it felt like weeks, but I think it was, you know, there's always like this really quick firestorm. So it was like a week of my phone was ringing. People were less on email then. It was really more about the phone. So my phone would ring, I'd pick it up, and in that moment, like, I'd have the conversation and hang up, and then I'd have like 10 voicemail messages. And it just went on and on and on. And it wasn't just US media, it was everyone in the world. Every country, every media outlet was calling, wanting to get some sort of media scoop on this book. So,
and I mean, email or phone calls instead of emails, you'd be working, you know, 3-4 times harder than somebody doing that same job today, right?
I know. So yeah, that was a really, I mean, an amazing, fun project. I worked on, at Goldberg McDuffie, I worked on Princess Diana's Bodyguards book. That was another very big media book. And then, you know, so many others that, you know, I love working on the big splashy books. That's always fun and always exciting. But I love working on a book that I feel at the end of a campaign, I feel like if I hadn't been a part of it, it wouldn't have gotten as much attention as it did. Like, when I feel like I've really made a difference on a book that might have been overlooked, like, that is an incredibly satisfying aspect of the job. So yeah, so Goldberg McDuffie, I was in the New York office. September 11th happened. It was I mean, I remember that day so vividly, as so many people do, we were working as an agency. We were working on Jack Welch's autobiography, and he was going to have a press conference that day at 11. And I got into the office like 8:45, and then the planes happened, and it just unfolded, and we were evacuated because our office was close to 30 Rock and NBC and the media, and so yeah, I mean, and all of the horror that happened, it was just a real long term. It was a real wake up call for me. I love New York. I knew like New York publishing is that's the epicenter of publishing, but I'm a fifth generation of a farming family in Southern California, and my family is the most important thing to me. And I just felt like I really wanted to be where my heart is. So it felt like career suicide to leave New York when I'm trying to do book publicity. But but Lynn Goldberg, amazing mentor and friend, she would not let me quit. She said, I think they read books in Los Angeles. Go see what you can do out there. And it was great. And I have really, I built up a local network in Los Angeles. And then I would work with authors, and some of them wouldn't even know I wasn't still in the New York office, because then at that time, that was, 2001, people were, much more internet savvy, and it was, I could get up really early and work with a UK client, and they wouldn't know the difference. So it was really great, and I'm so grateful that I was able to work for Goldberg McDuffie remotely as long as I did.
And were you vice president at that time, or did that come later?
I'm trying to think. No, I think I must have gotten that promotion while working remotely. So Lynn was always just so generous with her titles, and she wanted us to feel, because there is such a hierarchy in a publishing house of titles. Even though we were a small agency of like it sort of varied between 5 and 4 and 7 publicists in the agency, she wanted us to feel that we were on the same level as the publicists who were in-house at publishing houses. So yeah, so go ahead.
At that point, by the time you're moving out to LA, I'm assuming you had most of the contacts you would have needed to make in New York, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was it was great, because I had those contacts, and I would just always, whenever I go back to New York at least a few times a year, so I'm making sure I have that FaceTime, because I'm a firm believer that email is great and super efficient, but there's nothing like FaceTime for really having authentic connections with people. And that's advice that I give my authors too, is we can obviously get into that too, but don't stay in the ivory tower. You gotta write good books, but then you gotta get out in the world and talk to people and shake hands and sign books. And so yeah, so it worked out really well to have kind of the New York sensibility, but also figure out the LA literary landscape. So